Phoenix, Arizona. Thursday morning, October 3rd, 2025. The desert sun had barely crested the McDowell Mountains when the first emergency call crackled through the dispatch system at the Phoenix Police Department. A woman's voice, trembling and barely coherent, reported gunshots from the Sunrise Gardens apartment complex on East Thomas Road. Officers responded within minutes, their patrol cars cutting through the quiet residential streets where families were just beginning their morning routines. The apartment building stood 3 stories tall, its beige stucco facade weathered by years of relentless Arizona heat. Unit 2B sat at the end of a dim hallway on the 2nd floor, its door standing partially open. Officer Marcus Chen arrived first, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon as he approached. The silence emanating from within felt wrong, heavy with the kind of stillness that follows violence. Inside, the scene that greeted him would remain seared into his memory for years to come. A woman lay motionless on the kitchen floor, surrounded by shattered ceramic fragments from what appeared to have been a coffee mug. Her long, dark hair spilled across the linoleum, partially obscuring her face. The morning light streaming through the window caught on something metallic near her outstretched hand, a wedding ring that glinted with cruel indifference to the tragedy it now marked. Officer Chen called for backup, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. Within 20 minutes, the apartment had transformed into a controlled chaos of police personnel. Crime scene investigators moved with practiced efficiency, photographing every angle, documenting every detail. Detective Sarah Morrison, a 15-year veteran of the Homicide Division, took command of the scene with the quiet authority of someone who had witnessed too many preventable deaths. The victim's identification was found in her purse, which lay untouched on the kitchen counter. Gabriela Maria Santos, 34 years old, a registered nurse at Banner Good Samaritan Medical Center. Her employee badge still hung from her work bag. The photo, showing a woman with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile that seemed impossibly distant from the violence that had claimed her life. Detective Morrison crouched beside the body, her trained eye cataloging the evidence. 2 gunshot wounds, one to the chest and one to the abdomen. The positioning suggested close range, intimate proximity. No signs of forced entry. No indication of a struggle throughout the rest of the apartment. This was personal, she thought. Someone the victim knew. Someone she had trusted enough to let into her home, into her life. The apartment itself told a story of a life recently merged. In the living room, 2 distinct decorating styles competed for dominance. Delicate watercolor paintings of desert landscapes hung alongside sports memorabilia and framed concert posters. The bookshelf held romance novels stacked next to automotive magazines. In the bedroom, the closet revealed 2 wardrobes sharing space, one side filled with feminine dresses and blouses, the other with men's work shirts and jeans. A neighbor from across the hall, Mrs. Chen, no relation to the responding officer, stood in the doorway of her own apartment, wrapped in a floral bathrobe. Her hands shook as she spoke to the officers taking her statement. She had heard raised voices around 7:30 that morning, she explained. A man and a woman arguing, though she couldn't make out the words through the walls. Then came 2 sharp cracks that she initially mistook for a car backfiring. Only when she heard running footsteps in the hallway did she realize something terrible had happened. By the time she gathered the courage to peek outside, the hallway was empty and Unit 2B's door stood ajar, swaying slightly in the draft from the stairwell. The forensics team worked methodically through the apartment. In the kitchen, they found Gabriela's cell phone lying face down on the counter, its screen cracked but still functional. The last activity showed an unsent text message composed at 7:28 that morning. The recipient was simply labeled as "Mi Amor" with a heart emoji. The message itself consisted of only 3 words: "We need help." Detective Morrison bagged the phone as evidence, her mind already constructing timelines and scenarios. The victim had been trying to reach out to someone, possibly the same person who had ended her life. The closeness of the wounds, The lack of defensive injuries, the unlocked door, all pointed towards someone Gabriella knew intimately. Someone who lived here. In the bathroom, investigators found 2 toothbrushes in the holder, 2 sets of toiletries on the counter. The medicine cabinet revealed prescription bottles in 2 different names: Gabriela Maria Santos and David Michael Collins. The address on Collins' prescription matched this apartment. They were living together, possibly married, given the wedding ring. Detective Morrison stepped out into the hallway, pulling off her latex gloves. She needed to find David Collins, fast. Her instincts, honed by countless investigations, told her this case would unravel quickly once they located him. Men who killed their partners rarely disappeared for long. They either fled in panic or returned to the scene, unable to process what they had done. The apartment complex manager, a heavyset man named Robert Torres, arrived with a master key and a worried expression. He confirmed that Unit 2B was leased jointly to Gabriela Santos and David Collins. They had moved in together 6 months ago, in April. Young couple, he said. Seemed happy enough. Paid their rent on time. Never caused any trouble. He had seen David leaving the building that morning around 7:45, walking quickly toward the parking lot. Nothing seemed unusual at the time, just a man heading to work. Now, in hindsight, everything seemed sinister. The parking lot surveillance footage confirmed Torres's account. At exactly 7:46, a tall man in a blue work shirt and jeans appeared on camera, moving with purpose toward a silver Honda Civic. His face was partially obscured by a baseball cap pulled low, but his gait showed no sign of injury or distress. He climbed into the vehicle and drove away, turning right onto Thomas Road. The timestamp placed this departure less than 20 minutes after the estimated time of the gunshots. By noon, the Phoenix Police Department had issued a BOLO, a be on the lookout alert, for David Michael Collins. White male, 36 years old, 6 feet tall, approximately 180 pounds, brown hair, blue eyes. Last seen driving a silver 2021 Honda Civic with Arizona license plate number documented in the vehicle registration. Considered armed and extremely dangerous. Do not approach. Detective Morrison returned to the station to begin building her case file. The preliminary coroner's report arrived by early afternoon. Gabriela Santos had died from the gunshot wounds, bleeding out within minutes. The trajectory of the bullets suggested the shooter had been standing directly in front of her, no more than 5 feet away. The weapon appeared to be a 9mm handgun, though no casings had been found at the scene. The killer had either picked them up or used a revolver. The detective pulled up David Collins's background. No prior arrests. A clean record. He worked as a construction foreman for a mid-sized commercial building company. According to his employer, Collins was a reliable worker, quiet but competent. He had called in sick that morning, which was unusual for him. The employer expressed shock when informed of the situation. David seemed like a normal guy, he said. A bit reserved, but normal. Normal guys don't shoot their wives in the kitchen on a Thursday morning. Morrison thought grimly. As the investigation expanded, detectives began interviewing Gabriela's co-workers at the hospital. The picture they painted was of a dedicated nurse, beloved by her patients and respected by her colleagues. She worked the night shift in the cardiac unit, caring for heart attack victims and post-surgical patients with unwavering compassion. Her supervisor described her as the kind of person who would stay late to comfort a frightened patient or help a struggling colleague. One of Gabriela's closest friends at the hospital, a fellow nurse named Patricia Hernandez, broke down in tears during her interview. Gabriela had confided in her about troubles at home, Patricia revealed. Her husband had been distant lately, cold in ways he hadn't been when they first married. There had been arguments, though Gabriela never specified what they fought about. Patricia had urged her friend to seek counseling, but Gabriela had insisted she could work things out. She loved David, she had said. She just needed to give him time. Time, it seemed, had run out. The sun was setting over the Valley of the Sun when Detective Morrison's phone rang. A patrol unit had located David Collins' Honda Civic in the parking lot of a Motel 6 on the outskirts of Tempe, about 15 miles from the crime scene. The vehicle was empty, but thermal imaging suggested the engine had been running within the past few hours. Officers were setting up a perimeter around the motel, waiting for Morrison's arrival before making contact. As Morrison drove toward Tempe, her hands gripped the steering wheel with controlled tension. This was the moment that often determined whether cases ended peacefully or in more bloodshed. Cornered suspects made desperate choices. She radioed ahead, ordering the team to maintain their positions and wait for her arrival. No one was to approach Collins' room until she gave the word. The motel sat along a stretch of Apache Boulevard, cluttered with fast food restaurants and auto repair shops. Its neon sign flickered in the gathering darkness, advertising vacancies and weekly rates. The patrol cars had parked discreetly out of sight, their presence known only to the motel clerk, who had confirmed that a man matching Collins's description had checked in around 9 that morning, paying cash for 3 nights. Room 118, ground floor near the back of the property. Morrison could see the room from her position behind a patrol car. The curtains were drawn, but a sliver of light escaped around the edges. Someone was inside. She lifted her radio and spoke quietly to the tactical team that had assembled. Standard protocol. Announce, give him a chance to surrender peacefully. Only escalate if necessary. The megaphone crackled to life, breaking the evening quiet. David Collins, this is the Phoenix Police Department. We need you to come out of the room with your hands visible. The building is surrounded. There's no need for anyone else to get hurt. Silence. Long seconds stretched into a full minute. Morrison waited, her breath steady, her mind calculating probabilities. Then, movement. The door to room 118 opened slowly, and a figure emerged. Hands raised, shoulders slumped. The man who had been David Collins that morning now looked like someone else entirely. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. As officers moved in to secure him, Morrison noticed the blood on his shirt, dried to a dark rust color. David Collins did not resist. He allowed himself to be handcuffed, searched, and placed in the back of a patrol car without uttering a single word. In his motel room, investigators found the murder weapon, a Glock 19, lying on the bathroom counter next to an empty bottle of whiskey. No suicide note, no explanation, just a man and the gun he had used to end his wife's life. At the station, Morrison watched through the one-way glass as Collins sat alone in the interrogation room. He had waived his right to an attorney, saying only that he wanted to talk. This was unusual but not unheard of. Sometimes killers wanted to confess, to unburden themselves of the weight they could no longer carry. Morrison entered the room and sat across from him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, in a voice so quiet she almost missed it, David Collins said the words that would transform this from a domestic tragedy into something far more complex. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I swear to God I didn't know." Detective Morrison leaned forward. "Didn't know what, David?" He looked up, and in his eyes she saw something that stopped her cold. Not remorse, not grief, but rage, still simmering beneath the surface. That she used to be a man. Detective Morrison kept her expression neutral, though her mind raced. The revelation hung in the air between them like a live wire. She had worked enough cases to know that bias and prejudice could transform ordinary people into killers. But hearing it spoken aloud always carried a particular weight. "Tell me what happened." "David," she said quietly, her voice devoid of judgment. The interrogation room felt smaller now, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across Collins's face. He rubbed his eyes with cuffed hands, the metal chain clinking against the table. "We met online. Dating app. She was beautiful, funny, kind. Everything I thought I wanted," his voice cracked. "We talked for months before meeting in person. When we finally did, it felt right. Like coming home." Morrison let him speak, knowing that interruption would only stem the flow of information. Collins needed to tell this story, to justify what he had done, even if no justification existed. "We got married in April. Small ceremony, just us and a justice of the peace. She said her family was estranged, didn't want them there. I didn't push. My folks are gone, so it was just us." He paused, swallowing hard. I thought we were building something real. A future. When did you find out? Morrison asked. Yesterday. Wednesday afternoon. The words tumbled out faster now. I came home early from work. Feeling sick, maybe the flu. She was at the hospital working her shift. I went to grab some aspirin from the medicine cabinet, and that's when I saw it. A prescription bottle. Old one shoved in the back behind her makeup. Morrison knew what was coming, but let him continue. Testosterone blockers. The name on the label was Gabriel Santos, not Gabriela. Gabriel. He said the name with venom. I didn't understand at first. Thought maybe it was a typo. But then I started looking around. Really looking. Found other things. Old photos hidden in a shoebox at the back of the closet. Pictures of a young man who looked just like her. Same eyes, same smile. Medical records from a clinic in California. Surgical consultation notes. And you confronted her when she came home? Not right away. I couldn't process it. I felt like I'd been living with a stranger. Everything we had, every moment, every touch, it all felt like a lie. His voice rose. I had a right to know. Before we got married, before we stood in front of a judge and said vows, I had a right to know who I was really marrying. Morrison watched him carefully. The self-righteousness, the victimhood narrative, these were the tools people used to justify the unjustifiable. So you waited until this morning. I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about it, going over every conversation we'd ever had, looking for clues I'd missed. By the time she got home from her shift, I was already awake. She came in smiling, asked if I was feeling better, like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't been lying to me every single day. What did you say to her? Colin's jaw tightened. I asked her straight out, "Are you trans?" She froze. I could see it in her face, the panic. She tried to explain, said she was going to tell me but didn't know how, that she loved me and was scared of losing me. But all I could hear was admission. Confirmation that everything I thought I knew was fake. Where was the gun, David? In my truck. I keep it there for protection, working construction sites in rough neighborhoods. I'd brought it in the night before when I got home sick. Left it in the kitchen drawer. He looked down at his hands. We were arguing. She was crying, begging me to understand. Said she was still the same person I fell in love with. But that was the point. She wasn't. The person I fell in love with didn't exist. Morrison felt a cold anger building in her chest, but kept her voice steady. So you shot her. I don't even remember reaching for the gun. 1 second we were standing there, the next it was in my hand. She saw it and went quiet. Just looked at me with these big eyes, like she was waiting for me to tell her this was all some terrible joke. I told her I wanted her out of my life, out of my apartment. She said okay, said she'd leave, said whatever I wanted. But I couldn't stop thinking about how she'd fooled me. Made me look like an idiot, what people would say when they found out. So you killed her to protect your reputation. I killed her because she destroyed my life. The outburst echoed in the small room. Do you know what it's like to find out everything you believed was a lie? That the woman you married, the woman you shared a bed with, wasn't even really a woman? Morrison stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Gabriela Santos was a woman, a nurse who saved lives, a person who loved you enough to build a future with you. And you murdered her because your ego couldn't handle the truth. Colin stared at her, his expression hardening. I want a lawyer now. The interview was over. Morrison stepped out of the interrogation room, her hands trembling with barely contained rage. In the hallway, her partner, Detective James Rodriguez, waited with a grim expression. Got it all on tape, Rodriguez said. Clear premeditation. He had time to think, time to choose differently, and he still pulled that trigger. Morrison nodded. Check his phone records, computer history. I want to know if he was researching this, if he'd been planning it longer than he claims. Over the next 24 hours, the investigation revealed a more complete picture. David Collins' browser history showed searches beginning Wednesday evening. Can you divorce a trans person? Marriage, fraud, transgender. Is it illegal to not disclose trans status? The searches grew darker as the night progressed. Crimes of Passion, Arizona. Self-defense against deception. He had been building a justification, constructing a narrative where he was the victim and Gabriela was the villain. By morning, He had convinced himself that what he was about to do was somehow righteous. Meanwhile, Detective Morrison began piecing together Gabriella's life. Medical records confirmed she had transitioned in her early 20s while living in San Diego. She had moved to Phoenix 3 years ago for a fresh start, hoping to leave behind the discrimination and violence that too often shadowed transgender women. Her personnel file at the hospital showed exemplary performance. Reviews and multiple commendations for patient care. Friends from the LGBTQ community center in Phoenix painted a picture of a woman who had finally found peace with herself. Gabriella had attended support groups for transgender women, mentored younger people navigating their own transitions, and volunteered at youth outreach programs. She had been careful about dating, one friend revealed, terrified of rejection, or worse, when partners discovered her history. "She told me about David," said Carmen Martinez, a close friend. "Said he seemed different, accepting. She was going to tell him before they got married, but he proposed so suddenly, and she convinced herself it didn't matter, that her past was her past. She was so happy, thinking she'd finally found someone who loved her for who she was." The tragedy, Morrison realized, was that Gabriella had been right. David had fallen in love with exactly who she was. He just couldn't accept that the person he loved didn't fit into the narrow box he had constructed for acceptable reality. The district attorney's office charged David Collins with first-degree murder. The evidence was overwhelming: premeditation, clear motive, and his own recorded confession. Arizona law provided for enhanced sentencing in bias-motivated crimes, and the prosecution intended to pursue those charges as well. As Morrison closed the case file that evening, she thought about Gabriela Santos, a woman who had survived the difficult journey of transition, who had rebuilt her life with courage and grace, only to have it ended by the one person who should have protected her. The cruelty of it settled like a stone in Morrison's chest. Justice would be served in the courtroom. But for Gabriela, it came too late. The news of Gabriela Santos's death spread through Phoenix's LGBTQ community like wildfire. Within 48 hours, her photograph appeared on memorial posts across social media, accompanied by the hashtag Justice for Gabriela. The image most widely shared showed her in her nursing scrubs, smiling warmly at the camera, her hospital badge clipped to her pocket. It was a photo that captured who she had been: a healer, a caregiver, someone who had dedicated her life to helping others. The community center on 7th Avenue, where Gabriela had volunteered for 2 years, organized a vigil on Saturday evening. Hundreds gathered in the parking lot, holding candles that flickered against the desert night. Transgender women and men stood alongside allies, families, and friends, their faces reflecting grief and an all-too-familiar fear. This was not the first time they had gathered to mourn one of their own, and everyone present knew it would not be the last. Carmen Martinez stood at the makeshift podium, her voice breaking as she spoke. "Gabriela was my sister, not by blood, but by the bond we shared as trans women, surviving in a world that often doesn't want us to exist. She was kind when the world was cruel. She was brave when she had every reason to hide. And she loved deeply, even when that love was used as a weapon against her." The crowd murmured in agreement, some wiping away tears. A young trans woman in the front row clutched a sign reading, "Trans Lives Matter," with hands that trembled. Detective Morrison attended the vigil, standing at the edge of the gathering. She had not come in an official capacity, but felt compelled to witness the impact of the case she had worked. Listening to the testimonials, she learned things about Gabriela that police reports could never capture. How she had paid for a homeless trans teenager's hormone therapy when the girl's insurance denied coverage. How she had sat with frightened patients at the hospital, holding their hands through painful procedures. How she had laughed with unrestrained joy at drag shows, dancing until her feet hurt. One speaker, a transgender man named Marcus Chen, shared a particularly devastating memory. "Gabriela once told me she was afraid of dating, afraid that every man she met might turn violent when he learned her truth. I told her she was being paranoid, that things were getting better. I was wrong, and now she's gone. The vigil ended with a moment of silence, hundreds of people standing in the gathering darkness, candles flickering like stars brought down to earth. As the crowd dispersed, Morrison noticed several attendees approaching reporters, eager to ensure that Gabriella's story was told correctly, completely. The media coverage that followed proved to be a double-edged sword. Local news stations ran segments about the case, and while most treated it respectfully, focusing on the tragedy and the bias-motivated nature of the crime, others sensationalized it. One particular morning show host referred to it as the transgender deception case, framing Gabriella's decision not to immediately disclose her medical history as a form of fraud. The backlash was swift and fierce, with advocacy organizations condemning the coverage as transphobic and dangerous. At the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, prosecutor Rachel Chen was building her case. She had handled hate crime cases before, but this one carried particular weight. The evidence was solid. Collins' confession, the premeditation shown in his internet searches, the clear bias motivation. But Chen knew that securing a conviction with enhanced sentencing would require more than just evidence. It would require making a jury understand that Gabriella's life had value, that her identity was valid, and that Collins' actions constituted not just murder, but a hate crime. "We need to be prepared for the defense strategy," Chen told her team during a case review meeting. "They're going to argue provocation, claim that discovering his wife was transgender caused extreme emotional disturbance. They'll try to make Collins the victim." Her assistant, a young prosecutor named James Okafor, shook his head in disgust. "How is learning something about your spouse's medical history a legal justification for murder?" "It's not," Chen replied. "But they'll argue it anyway. We need witnesses who can speak to Gabriella's character, to the challenges trans people face, and to the fact that Collins had multiple opportunities to walk away without violence." The prosecution team began reaching out to Gabriella's former colleagues, friends, and members of the transgender community. Dr. Helena Vasquez, a psychologist specializing in gender identity issues, agreed to serve as an expert witness, explaining to the jury the discrimination and violence that transgender individuals routinely faced. Meanwhile, Collins had retained a defense attorney, Marcus Webb, a seasoned criminal lawyer known for taking controversial cases. Webb's strategy became apparent during pretrial hearings. He filed motions arguing that Collins had been the victim of fraudulent inducement into marriage, claiming his client had suffered severe emotional trauma upon discovering his wife's biological sex. Judge Patricia Morales denied most of these motions with barely concealed contempt. "Mr. Webb, this court will not entertain arguments that dehumanize the victim or suggest that her identity somehow justified her murder. Your client is charged with first-degree murder. The victim's medical history is not on trial here." Still, Webb persisted. In media interviews, he painted Collins as a confused man who had reacted poorly to devastating news. The narrative he constructed was insidious. Collins wasn't a murderer. He was a victim of deception who had snapped under unbearable psychological pressure. The transgender community watched these developments with weary recognition. This was the same playbook used in other cases, the trans panic defense that had been successfully banned in several states but remained a persuasive tool in Arizona courtrooms. Advocacy groups mobilized, holding press conferences, writing op-eds, and organizing rallies outside the courthouse. Detective Morrison, meanwhile, continued to investigate, wanting to ensure no detail was overlooked. She interviewed Gabriella's supervisor at Banner Good Samaritan Medical Center, who provided personnel records showing Gabriella had properly disclosed her transgender status during the hiring process, as required by law. Her medical transition had never affected her ability to perform her duties with excellence. Morrison also tracked down Gabriella's therapist, Dr. Linda Reyes, who provided crucial context with her patient's posthumous permission granted through medical records release. Gabriella struggled with when to disclose her history to romantic partners, Dr. Reyes explained. She had been assaulted twice before by men who reacted violently. The trauma made her cautious, sometimes to a fault. But she always intended to tell David she was just trying to find the right moment when she felt safe enough. That detail, Morrison realized, was crucial. Gabriella hadn't been deceptive. She had been terrified, and her fear had proven tragically justified. As the trial date approached, the case took on larger significance beyond Phoenix. National LGBTQ organizations cited it as evidence of the ongoing violence against transgender individuals, particularly transgender women of color. Statistics were cited. Transgender people faced violence at rates exponentially higher than the general population, with trans women of color being especially vulnerable. But amid the statistics and the legal maneuvering, Morrison tried to keep one thing centered in her mind. Gabriela Santos had been a real person, a woman who loved her work, who helped her friends, who danced with joy, who fell in love and dared to hope for happiness. She deserved justice not as a symbol or a statistic, but as a human being whose life had been stolen by someone who claimed to love her. The trial was set to begin in January 2026, and everyone involved knew it would be about more than just one man's guilt or innocence. It would be about whether the legal system could recognize the full humanity of a woman whose only crime had been trusting the wrong person with her. Truth. January 13, 2026, the Maricopa County Superior Court building stood against a pale winter sky, its modern glass facade reflecting the crowd gathered on the courthouse steps. Protesters held signs demanding justice, while news vans lined the street, satellite dishes pointed skyward. Inside courtroom 4C, the air felt heavy with anticipation as jury selection concluded and opening statements prepared to begin. David Collins sat at the defense table in a navy suit, his expression carefully neutral. His attorney, Marcus Webb, had coached him well on courtroom demeanor. No emotion, no reaction, project quiet dignity. Across the aisle, prosecutor Rachel Chen reviewed her notes one final time, her jaw set with determination. Judge Patricia Morales entered, and the room rose as one. She was a no-nonsense jurist with 20 years on the bench, known for running a tight courtroom. "Be seated," she commanded. "We'll proceed with opening statements. Ms. Chen, you may begin." Chen approached the jury box, making eye contact with each of the 12 men and women who would decide this case. Gabriela Santos woke up on October 3, 2025, after working a night shift saving lives at Banner Good Samaritan Medical Center. She came home to the apartment she shared with her husband, tired but looking forward to rest. Instead, she was murdered, shot twice at close range by the man who promised to love and cherish her. She paused, letting the words settle. "The defense will try to confuse you. They'll talk about deception, about trauma, about a man pushed beyond his limits. But the evidence will show you something much simpler and much darker. David Collins discovered something about his wife's medical history that wounded his pride, and rather than simply ending the marriage, he ended her life. That is not passion. That is not trauma. That is murder." Webb's opening countered with the narrative he had been crafting since his first motion. "David Collins is a victim too," he told the jury. "A victim of a fraud so profound, so intimate, that it shattered his entire sense of reality. Imagine discovering that the most important relationship in your life was built on a lie, that the person sleeping beside you every night had hidden something fundamental about who they were." Judge Morales interrupted. "Mr. Webb, I remind you that the victim's identity is not on trial here." Webb nodded smoothly. "Of course, Your Honor. I'm simply providing context for my client's state of mind." David Collins reacted in a moment of extreme emotional disturbance to information that would devastate any reasonable person. "This is not premeditated murder. This is a tragedy born of deception and psychological trauma. The first week of trial focused on establishing the facts. Detective Morrison took the stand, walking the jury through the investigation. She described the crime scene, the evidence collected, and the timeline that led to Collins' arrest. Under cross-examination, Webb tried to emphasize the lack of planning, suggesting the gun had been accessible by chance rather than intent. "Detective Morrison," Webb asked, "isn't it true that Mr. Collins kept the weapon in his truck for legitimate work-related safety concerns?" "Yes," Morrison replied evenly. "But he brought it into the apartment the night before, and it was within reach when he chose to use it." Chose, or reacted in a moment of psychological crisis. "He had time to think," Morrison said firmly. "Time to walk away." He chose violence. The prosecution's medical examiner testified about Gabriella's wounds, explaining that both shots had been fired from less than 4 feet away, directly facing the victim. "These were not accidental discharges," Dr. Patricia Wong stated. "The shooter was standing in front of Ms. Santos, aimed and fired twice." Then came the testimony that changed the courtroom's atmosphere. Carmen Martinez took the stand, her composure fragile but intact. Chen guided her through questions about her friendship with Gabriella. "She told me she was scared to tell David about her transition," Carmen said quietly. She'd been attacked before, twice. Once, a man she dated for 3 months beat her so badly she needed reconstructive facial surgery. The other time, she was stabbed and left bleeding in a parking lot. She survived both times, but the fear never left her. "Did she plan to tell David?" Chen asked. "Yes. She was working up the courage. She loved him and wanted complete honesty, but she was terrified of exactly what ended up happening." Webb's cross-examination was aggressive. "Ms. Martinez, isn't it true that withholding such information constitutes fraud?" "Objection," Chen said sharply. "Argumentative and assumes facts not in evidence. Sustained," Judge Morales ruled. "Rephrase, Mr. Webb." The defense attorney tried another angle. "Don't you think Mr. Collins had a right to know before entering into marriage?" Carmen looked directly at him. "I think Gabriella had a right to live. That right outweighs everything else." Dr. Helena Vasquez, the prosecution's expert on gender identity, spent an entire day explaining to the jury the realities of being transgender in America. She cited statistics on violence, discrimination, and the psychological toll of constant fear. Transgender women, particularly trans women of color, face epidemic levels of violence, she testified. The decision of when to disclose their medical history is often literally a matter of life and death. The defense countered with their own psychologist, who testified about fraud-induced trauma and suggested Collins had experienced a psychological break. But under Chen's cross-examination, the expert admitted he had never actually examined Collins and was basing his opinion solely on hypothetical scenarios. The most damaging evidence came from Collins' own digital footprint. Chen presented his internet search history to the jury, showing the progression from Wednesday evening through Thursday morning. "Can you divorce a trans person at 9:47 p.m., marriage fraud transgender at 10:23 p.m., then, after midnight, crimes of passion Arizona. At 3:17 a.m., how long does murder investigation take?" "Ladies and gentlemen," Chen told the jury during her closing argument 3 weeks later, "this was not a crime of passion. This was a man who spent hours researching, planning, and justifying murder. When Gabriella came home from saving lives, David Collins was waiting with a loaded gun and a decision already made. He chose pride over her life. He chose violence over divorce. He chose murder." Webb's closing emphasized the emotional component. "My client's world collapsed. Everything he believed shattered in an instant. We're not asking you to excuse what happened. We're asking you to understand it, to recognize that this was not cold-blooded murder, but a tragic reaction to unbearable circumstances." The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the forewoman stood and delivered the verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. guilty of bias-motivated crime enhancement. The courtroom erupted in muted reactions, some wiping tears of relief, others shaking their heads. Collins showed no emotion as he was remanded into custody. But in the gallery, Gabriella's friends and community members held each other. Their grief mixed with a small measure of justice finally served. Judge Morales set sentencing for February, but everyone present knew what was coming. In Arizona, first-degree murder with bias enhancement carried a mandatory sentence of life without the possibility of parole. David Collins would spend the rest of his days in prison, while Gabriela Santos would remain forever 34, her potential unfulfilled, her kindness silenced. February 14th, 2026. Valentine's Day seemed a cruel coincidence for David Collins' sentencing hearing, though no one in courtroom 4C mentioned the irony aloud. The gallery was packed with the same faces that had attended the trial, Gabriella's co-workers in their hospital scrubs, members of the LGBTQ community wearing purple ribbons in her memory, journalists with notebooks balanced on their knees, and Detective Morrison, who had promised herself she would see this case through to its conclusion. Judge Morales surveyed the courtroom before beginning. We're here today for the sentencing of David Michael Collins, convicted of first-degree murder with bias-motivated crime enhancement in the death of Gabriela Maria Santos. Before I impose sentence, the court will hear victim impact statements. Carmen Martinez was the first to approach the podium, her hands gripping a folded piece of paper. She had written her statement weeks ago, but found herself unable to read it. Speaking instead from the grief that still felt raw, Gabriela was supposed to be at my daughter's quinceañera next month, Carmen began, her voice wavering. She was going to help with the choreography, teach my girl how to dance with confidence the way only Gabriela could. Instead, I'll have to explain to my daughter why her tia Gabi isn't coming. Why a man decided that his ego was worth more than her life. She looked directly at Collins, who sat motionless at the defense table. You didn't just kill my friend. You killed every patient she would have saved, every person she would have helped, every moment of joy she would have brought into the world. You took all of that because you were embarrassed. That's what this comes down to. You were embarrassed, and you decided she should die for it. Patricia Hernandez, Gabriela's colleague from the hospital, spoke next. I worked alongside Gabriela for 3 years. I watched her stay late to comfort dying patients, hold the hands of scared children, celebrate when someone got to go home healthy. She gave everything to her work because she understood suffering. She had lived through it. Her voice broke. The night before she died, she told me she was happy. Finally, truly happy. And the next morning, she was gone. Dr. Marcus Chen, the hospital's chief of cardiology, provided a professional assessment. Nurse Santos was one of our finest staff members. Her patient satisfaction scores were consistently the highest in the unit. She saved lives, and she did it with compassion and skill. The healthcare profession and our community has lost someone irreplaceable. One by one, they came forward. A young transgender woman Gabriela had mentored through her transition, a neighbor who remembered her kindness, a ballroom performer who had competed alongside her. Each testimony built a portrait of a life that had mattered, that had touched dozens of people, that had been extinguished for the most senseless of reasons. When the statements concluded, Judge Morales turned to the defense table. Mr. Collins, you have the right to address the court before sentencing. Do you wish to speak? Collins stood slowly, and for the first time since his arrest, emotion flickered across his face. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, perhaps in caution, but Collins shook it off. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. I'm not the monster you all think I am, he said. I loved her. I really did. But when I found out the truth, everything I thought I knew just broke. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't breathe, and I reacted in the worst possible way. He paused, seeming to search for more words, but Judge Morales' expression remained impassive. Finally, he added, I'm sorry, though whether he meant it or simply knew it was expected remained unclear. He sat back down, and the courtroom waited. Judge Morales took her time before speaking, letting the silence stretch until everyone present felt its weight. When she finally began, her voice carried the authority of decades on the bench. "Mr. Collins, I have presided over hundreds of cases in my career. I've seen crimes of desperation, of greed, of rage. But what you did falls into a category that troubles me most deeply. You committed murder because your pride could not withstand a truth that challenged your self-image." She leaned forward slightly. Gabriela Santos was under no legal obligation to disclose her medical history to you before marriage. Her transition was a private medical matter. The fact that you felt entitled to that information does not justify violence. The fact that learning it upset you does not mitigate your crime. You had countless options. You could have filed for divorce. You could have sought counseling. You could have simply walked away. Instead, you chose to take a gun and end the life of a woman whose only crime was trusting you with her vulnerability. The courtroom was utterly silent. The jury found you guilty of first-degree murder, and the evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. Your internet searches show a man who spent hours contemplating violence, researching justifications, preparing himself psychologically to kill. This was not a snap decision. This was a choice you made repeatedly over the course of hours. Judge Morales glanced at her notes. Additionally, the jury found that you committed this crime with bias against Ms. Santos based on her gender identity. This enhancement is not a minor detail. It reflects the reality that transgender individuals, particularly transgender women of color, face disproportionate violence in our society. Your actions contributed to a pattern of hatred that has claimed too many lives. She straightened in her chair. Therefore, pursuant to Arizona law, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Additionally, for the bias-motivated enhancement, I impose a consecutive term of 10 years. You will spend the remainder of your natural life in the custody of the Arizona Department of Corrections. The gavel struck once, final and absolute. Collins's shoulders slumped, and corrections officers moved to escort him from the courtroom. As he passed through the gallery, not a single person met his eyes. He had become what he feared most: invisible, irrelevant, forgotten. Outside the courthouse, Prosecutor Rachel Chen held a brief press conference. Cameras flashed as she read from a prepared statement. Today, justice was served for Gabriela Santos. But let me be clear, no sentence can bring her back. No verdict can undo the harm done to her family, her friends, and her community. What we can do is affirm that transgender lives have value, that bias-motivated violence will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and that loving someone does not give you ownership over their life or their truth. Detective Morrison stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the proceedings with mixed feelings. Justice had been achieved within the legal system, but the emptiness remained. Gabriela was still gone. Another trans woman was still dead. And somewhere else in America, another person was likely hiding their identity out of fear of meeting the same fate. As the crowd dispersed, Morrison noticed Carmen Martinez sitting alone on a bench near the courthouse entrance, staring at a photo on her phone. Morrison approached quietly and sat beside her. "That's her?" Morrison asked, nodding at the screen. Carmen nodded. "Last year's Pride Parade. Look at that smile." The photo showed Gabriela in a rainbow dress, arms raised in joy, surrounded by friends. The life in her eyes was almost painful to see now, knowing how it had ended. "The case is closed," Morrison said softly. "But if you ever need anything, you call me." Carmen looked at her with tired eyes. "What I need is my friend back. But I guess we don't always get what we need." They sat together in silence as the February sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps where justice had been declared, but peace remained elusive. 3 months after the sentencing, life in Phoenix moved forward with the relentless momentum that cities possess. The news cycle had shifted to other tragedies, other headlines. David Collins became another inmate in the Arizona state prison system. his name appearing only occasionally in legal databases when his automatic appeals were filed and denied. But for those who had known Gabriela Santos, time moved differently. The cardiac unit at Banner Good Samaritan Medical Center established the Gabriela Santos Memorial Scholarship, providing financial assistance to nursing students from marginalized communities. Her former supervisor, during the dedication ceremony, spoke about Gabriela's legacy of compassionate care. She believed that everyone deserved dignity, especially in their most vulnerable moments. This scholarship ensures that belief lives on. Carmen Martinez channeled her grief into activism. She joined the board of directors at the Phoenix LGBTQ Community Center and began facilitating support groups specifically for transgender individuals navigating relationships and disclosure. Gabriela's story doesn't have to be the only ending, she told participants. We can create different outcomes by building community, sharing resources, and teaching people that they deserve safety and love. The support group grew steadily, drawing transgender people from across the Phoenix metro area. They shared stories of discrimination, fear, and resilience. Some discussed strategies for safe disclosure to partners. Others simply sought a space where they could exist without explanation or justification. In that room, Gabriela's absence was felt acutely, but her influence remained tangible. Detective Morrison returned to her regular caseload, investigating homicides with the same methodical precision she had always employed. But the case had changed something in her. She began attending training sessions on LGBTQ cultural competency for law enforcement, eventually becoming a department trainer herself. We can't bring back the victims, she told fellow officers during one session, but we can do better by the living. Prosecutor Rachel Chen used the case as a foundation for advocating legislative change. She testified before the Arizona State Legislature in support of a bill that would explicitly ban the trans panic defense, joining 14 other states that had already closed this legal loophole. We cannot allow defendants to argue that discovering someone's transgender identity justifies violence, she argued. Such defenses are rooted in prejudice, not law, and they have no place in our justice system. The bill faced opposition from conservative lawmakers who claimed it infringed on defendants' rights to present a complete defense. But advocacy organizations mobilized, sharing Gabriela's story alongside dozens of similar cases nationwide. By the end of 2026, the legislation passed, prohibiting defendants in Arizona from using a victim's sexual orientation or gender identity as justification for violent crimes. The ballroom community in Phoenix held an annual memorial ball in Gabriela's honor, celebrating both her life and the ongoing resilience of transgender performers. The events drew hundreds of participants, transforming grief into art, pain into beauty. Young trans women walked the runway in sequined gowns, their confidence a defiant response to the violence that too often targeted their community. At the second annual Memorial Ball in October 2027, a 19-year-old performer named Sophia dedicated her performance to Gabriela. I never met her, Sophia said into the microphone, but her story gave me courage to live authentically. She showed me that being trans doesn't mean accepting less than we deserve. It means demanding more, being more, living more fully than the world expects us to. The crowd erupted in applause, voguing and cheering in celebration of survival and visibility, yet the statistics remained sobering. In the 2 years following Gabriela's death, 23 transgender individuals were murdered in the United States, with trans women of color comprising the majority of victims. Advocacy organizations continued documenting these losses, transforming names into movements, tragedies into calls for action. Detective Morrison kept a folder in her desk drawer containing articles about the legislative victory, photos from the memorial balls, and letters from community members thanking her for treating Gabriela's case with dignity. On difficult days, when another body was found, another family shattered, she would open that folder and remind herself that individual actions mattered, that justice, however imperfect, had value. In a small cemetery in San Diego, where Gabriella's family had laid her to rest, fresh flowers appeared regularly on her headstone. The inscription read simply, Gabriela Maria Santos, beloved nurse, cherished friend, beautiful soul. Her light continues. Visitors to the grave often left small tokens, rainbow ribbons, handwritten notes, photographs. One letter, left by a teenager who had never met Gabriella, read, "Thank you for being brave enough to live as yourself. Your story helped me come out to my parents. I'm safe, I'm loved, and I'm here because you showed me it was possible." The case of Gabriela Santos became a reference point in discussions about transgender rights, intimate partner violence, and the legal system's treatment of bias crimes. Law schools studied it. Advocacy groups cited it. Journalists returned to it when similar tragedies occurred, drawing connections between individual acts of violence and systemic prejudice. But beyond the statistics and the legal precedents, beyond the scholarships and memorial balls, Gabriella's legacy lived most powerfully in the quiet moments. A nurse holding a frightened patient's hand with extra tenderness, remembering Gabriella's compassion. A trans woman choosing to trust a new partner with her truth, believing that not all disclosure ends in violence. A community gathering to support one another, refusing to let fear extinguish their visibility. David Collins would spend his remaining years in prison, a cautionary tale about the deadly consequences of pride and prejudice. But Gabriela Santos, in Death as in Life, became something more, a reminder that every person deserves safety, dignity, and the freedom to exist authentically. The emptiness her death created could never be filled. But in the spaces where she had walked, danced, cared, and loved, her presence lingered like light that continues traveling long after its source has been extinguished. Justice had been served. Healing remained ongoing, and the work of creating a world where Gabriella's story could not repeat itself continued, one brave heart at a time.